In our perception, the era of the Crusades is a story of bloody conflict that lasted 2 centuries and ended in the inevitable defeat of the West. We remember the fall of Jerusalem, the loss of Acre, and the final expulsion of the Crusaders in 1291. For us, the Kingdom of Jerusalem is a temporary anomaly, a foreign body rejected by the East. History took a path of harsh division. Europe remained in the West, while the Middle East came under the control of Islamic powers, first the Mamluks, then the Ottomans. But this inevitability is an illusion created by hindsight. In the 12th century, the Latin East, or Outremer, land beyond the sea, was not just a military camp, but a rapidly developing state where the West and the East began to intertwine into a single knot. The kings of Jerusalem minted coins with Arabic script, European architects adopted Syrian technologies, and trade routes connected London with Baghdad via the ports of Acre and Tyre. The collapse of this state was caused not by civilizational incompatibility, but by a series of specific military and political mistakes and a demographic deficit. But what if the key decisions of 1187 had been different? What if the Kingdom of Jerusalem had not fallen under Saladin's blows, but had survived, turning into a powerful maritime empire, the Levantine Frankish state? Imagine a world where the Holy Land became not a battlefield, but an eternal bridge between civilizations. A world where Constantinople did not fall and the Ottoman Empire was never born. Watch the video to the end to find out how the history of the stable Levantine Frankish Empire might have changed. Let's look at the real map of events on the eve of the catastrophe. By the 1180s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was indeed at the height of its power and possessions, but the external picture concealed a weak internal foundation. The state stretched along a narrow coastal line, like a long corridor between the sea and the desert. This geography provided large revenues from harbors and trade, but complicated defense and communication between the lands. The kingdom depended on ports as the heart of its treasury and supply. While the enemy battered the walls, the barons argued within them, and these disputes weakened the kingdom faster than anyone wanted to admit. Its strength lay in its heavy knightly cavalry and fortified system of castles. But fighting with force alone is half a victory, not a complete victory. The knights possessed weapons, armor, and military training that were modern for their time and inspired fear on the battlefield. The castles were tall, strong, built in the European style. Thick walls, narrow entrances, well-fortified towers. But fortresses hold land, and there were not enough people to hold it. The treasury grew, influence grew, but the size of the army did not. This was not immediately apparent, but it was tragically important. The kingdom's ports, especially Acre and Tyre, did indeed live off trade with the East, but they could only defend themselves as long as they were fed by the sea and their allies. The kingdom controlled some of the key trading hubs along the Silk Road through the mediation of ports, caravans, and neighboring agreements, but it did not directly control the entire corridor of the route. It was wealth through connections, not through direct control. Alliances fed the crown, but did not unite the elites. And the elites forgot this, taking pride not in alliances, but in swords. Any vertical empire is strong as long as its subjects feel that it is their extension. But in the Levant, this feeling was shaky. The Franks did not completely destroy the customs of local communities, but they did not allow them to appropriate themselves spiritually. The southern and eastern communities lived side by side with the crown, but not within it. People needed not only protection, but also a sense of just authority. But that sense was blurred, and storming the enemy cannot compensate for a lack of meaning. It will only hasten the collapse. Saladin did not simply assemble an army. He united part of the Islamic world around the idea of resistance to the West. He was a charismatic and talented leader who understood the importance of the rear and motivation, not just a frontal assault. He united Egypt and Syria not with the comfort of peace, but with the logic of strengthening. Islamic unity was not new, it was necessary. Saladin spoke simply but acted on a grand scale, because scale matters when people are your rear. Their rear was wider than the Frankish front, and the front was narrow, and that was the beginning of the end. The kingdom's demographics were indeed the first weak point, which became almost impossible to quickly compensate for during the war. The Franks were a ruling minority among the majority of local residents. The locals needed opportunities, not just walls. but there were few opportunities, and this weakened their sense of belonging. As the Islamic world grew stronger, the Frankish rear became quieter and weaker. Quieter meant that strategic warnings were not heard in time. The number of defenders was decreasing faster than the confidence of the crown, and the crown felt that it stood alone. The alliance between Egypt and Syria under Saladin became the second strategic pincer of pressure. The pincers worked not only with the sword, but also with the logic of surrounding supply routes. The kingdom became a thin line between two strong pillars of the East, and the East was the strongest pillar in the tactical calendar. Europe was not yet. The death of Baldwin IV truly became a historical turning point when the balance of the elite collapsed. The sick king was respected, and respect keeps a baron in check, even if the baron argues. Under his hand, politicians held out longer than the front. But after his death, the struggle for influence began. And the influence of the barons was greater than the wisdom of the crown. The accession of Guy de Lusignan was a turning point not only in strategy, but also in the political influence of the hawks and provocateurs. Guy was a brave warrior, but a weak strategist and susceptible to the influence of the barons. He needed the support of alliances, but was unable to manage them any better than he could manage a sword. Renaud de Chatillon did indeed break the truce by attacking Muslim caravans, which became the real trigger for Saladin's declaration of jihad. This jihad was a reaction of meaning, not a new clash of logistics. And the clash was lost not by force, but by influence. The Battle of Hattin became a real tactical disaster of the era in the summer of 1187. Now let's imagine that on that hot July day, common sense prevailed over pride. What if events had turned out differently? Let's go back to the beginning of July 1187. Saladin's army is besieging the city of Tiberias. The Sultan deliberately chooses this position to lure the Crusader army out of their fortified camp at the springs of Sephoria into the sun-scorched desert. In our story, the opinion of the hawks prevailed at the Council of War, accusing the king of cowardice. But let's assume that in this reality, the voice of Count Raymond III of Tripoli, an experienced tactician, sounds more convincing. He utters the same words as in the Chronicles. Tiberias is just stones and people. The kingdom is the army. If we keep the army, we will get the stones back. If we lose the army, we will lose everything. Guy de Lusignan makes a difficult, unpopular, but salvific decision. The Frankish army does not move from its position. It remains near the abundant water sources in Sephoria, in the shade of olive groves, in fortified positions. Saladin waits a day, 2 days, a week. His huge army, assembled from different tribes, begins to suffer from the heat and inactivity. The water in the vicinity of Tiberias runs out. The emirs begin to grumble, wanting to return home for the harvest. Saladin, realizing that storming the fortified Frankish camp would be suicidal, is forced to lift the siege and retreat to Damascus. The campaign of 1187 ends in nothing. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the cream of the knighthood, the military orders of the Templars and Hospitallers, is preserved. Jerusalem has not fallen. This non-occurrence of defeat changed the entire dynamic. The Third Crusade, which was already gathering in Europe, Frederick Barbarossa, Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, arrived not at a pile of ashes to reclaim ruins, but at a fully functioning state. This is no longer a rescue operation, but a powerful reinforcement. The enormous combined forces of Europe and the local kingdom go on the offensive, finally capturing the Egyptian front and strategic ports, putting Saladin in a critical position. The survival of a state surrounded by hostile neighbors would require a radical restructuring of the military machine and infrastructure. The Levantine power of the 13th century would represent a unique synthesis of European fortification and Eastern adaptability. A network of concentric castles would form the basis of the defense. Crac des Chevaliers was only a prototype. Under conditions of constant threat, the Franks would have created a deeply echeloned defense system where each city would be a fortress capable of withstanding months-long sieges thanks to huge water cisterns and grain stores. Castles would cease to be mere residences for feudal lords. They would become administrative centers and logistics bases. The second key factor would be the navy. The Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, would turn the Levant coast into their main base. Constant patrolling of the sea from Alexandria to Antioch would ensure the uninterrupted supply of reinforcements and food from Europe. Logistics would become the Franks' main weapon. While the armies of the East depended on seasonality and harvests, the Outre-mer would be supplied by sea all year round. In field tactics, there would be a complete rejection of the purely European model of heavy cavalry, ramming in favor of a hybrid army. A significant part of the troops would be made up of Turcopoles, light cavalry recruited from local residents and baptized Turks, armed with bows. The nightly charge would become only the final argument, used after exhausting the enemy with archery, following the example of Byzantine tactics. Let's imagine for a moment how society itself would change. Preserving the kingdom for a long time would make people feel not just like immigrants, but like a new nation with its own proud destiny. In reality, the term poulain was used to refer to a mixed generation of Franks and Levantines who grew up in the East, and it often sounded like a reproach. But if the state had been successful and stable, the word would have become a sign of strength and uniqueness rather than weakness. People themselves would have started saying, "We are not the West, we are not the East, we are a new in-between." And it was precisely this new in-between that would have made them stronger in the long run. Having lost the chance to return to Europe, they would have gained the chance to create an improved version of it in the Levant. And they would have improved it through survival, climate, and the logic of maritime policy. The Puluns would not simply adapt to the land, they would adapt the land to themselves, just as a clan adapts its hearth to winter. The warriors of that time knew that a brave horseman is strong in the context of alliances, but the strongest alliance is one where the people feel like the rearguard of the crown. Therefore, European sarcasm would become a symbol of frontier self-irony. And self-irony does not break, it strengthens. The kingdom would lose its similarity in form, but it would gain similarity in the goals of family, trade, and the balance of daily survival. People would need not only the fortification of the body, but also the fortification of us. And this word would become their blanket of mental winter. It would be a frontier society where survival depends on flexibility, practicality, trade, and intelligence. In such a society, kings and barons would finally recognize that territory is held by numbers, trust, and the supply of resources, not just by the sword. By the 13th century, the Outre-mer had already become more Eastern in the daily life of many Franks who had lived there for generations. In a balanced model, people would know how to build a political rear as carefully as they caught cracks in winter. A Frankish lord here would not rule alone. He would rule the minds of his subjects, and those minds would become stronger than the walls and smoother than the roads of the Silk Road. And the sea would become their line of opportunity, evenly in tomorrow. The Frankish nobility, while remaining Catholic in faith, would inevitably adopt the everyday habits of the East, because the future belongs to those who do not argue with the weather and the terrain. They would choose not a long dispute over the crown, but a long dispute over logistics. Control over ports, the supply of provisions, and a sense of belonging would create a new subject. A subject cannot be held only with a sword. You cannot warm a subject with a fur coat if his soul is wet. But a wet soul can be dried by the voice of a storyteller and the ship's logic of the shore. And the future would be closer to those who began to understand that wealth does not come from fate on paper. It comes from fate in the harbor. Bilingualism would become the norm, not out of cultural romanticism, but out of pragmatic advantage and the necessity of the frontier. The fact remains, any trading hub is only rich if it is understood in several languages at once. People would speak French and Arabic or Greek not by order, but out of necessity for diplomacy, trade, the export of knowledge, and the exchange of bridges between communities. Translators would become more important than provocateurs, and provocateurs would be quieter than translators if they were not drowned out by the baron's attention. The mixing of languages would become the capital of trust. Trust would become the currency of security. Security would become a new calendar. The calendar would be warmed by communication. Communication would flow through the fires of baths and madrasas. The oil lamps of conversation would burn longer than anger, and anger would be stronger than a forgotten word. Religious policy would inevitably evolve from intolerance to the idea of protectorate loyalty because dogmas are important, but life is more important than dogmas when you are surrounded by a hot frontier rather than a warm palace room. The Jerusalem Assizes really did establish order and laws, but they could also have become the first form of fixing rights and opportunities for Orthodox, Maronite, Jacobite, and Muslim communities in the context of the kingdom's long-term stability. Churches and mosques would stand side by side not as an exception, but as a rule of the frontier, where pilgrims of the three religions would pay taxes, and taxes would be the wealth of the crown, and wealth would be the understandable future of a subject who argues with luck, but does not argue with the calendar of the fence. So far, the harbors of the Vikings and Byzantines have proven that the rear of the people can generate less fear and more trade, and that would be the second engineering of life, where the crown does not lose heart, as long as it is held together by the delivery of words and layers of trust between inside the fence and outside the map. The economic foundation of such a state would be colossal. By holding the ports of the Levant, Acre, Tyre, Beirut, Jaffa, the Frankish state would become the bottleneck for all trade between Asia and Europe. The Silk Road would end not in the hands of the Muslim rulers of Egypt or Turkey, but in the customs terminals of the Franks. Spices, silk, and porcelain would pass through Christian ports. This would give the kingdom resources incomparable to the incomes of European monarchies. The Jerusalem Byzant, a gold coin modeled on the dinar, would become the main currency of the Mediterranean, the dollar of the Middle Ages. But it was not just about transit. The Levant would have become a center of production. The Franks would have actively introduced new crops, sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits. Sugarcane plantations around Tyre and Acre, cultivated using advanced irrigation technologies, would have supplied sugar to all of Europe long before the discovery of America. Industrial espionage and knowledge exchange would have led to paper, glass, and silk production technologies reaching Europe centuries earlier and on a larger scale. Acre in the 13th, 14th centuries would have resembled Hong Kong or Singapore of its time. A cosmopolitan city of skyscrapers, chronicles mention 5 or 6-story buildings in Acre, where deals worth millions were made. How might the course of world history have changed if a different decision had been made on one geopolitical puzzle? The mid-13th century brought a hurricane to the Middle East, the Mongol invasion. In real history, the weakened remnants of the Crusaders remained neutral, allowing the Egyptian Mamluks to defeat the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260. This saved the Islamic world and doomed the Crusaders. In our reality, the powerful kingdom of Jerusalem becomes a natural ally of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol Empire in Persia. The Mongols, among whom there were many Nestorian Christians, and the Franks form a full-fledged military alliance against their common enemy, Egypt. In 1260, Franco-Mongol troops defeat the Mamluks. The Egyptian Sultanate falls. This event changes everything. The Islamic world loses its political center. Cairo comes under the protectorate of the Allies. An even more important consequence concerns Byzantium. The Fourth Crusade, 1204, which destroyed Constantinople, simply makes no sense in this reality. Since the road to Jerusalem is open and safe, and the Levant is rich and pays for mercenaries, the Venetians have no need to redirect the Crusaders to plunder Byzantium. Constantinople has survived. The Byzantine Empire, relying on its alliance with the Latin East, retains control over Asia Minor. The Turkic tribes, ancestors of the future Ottomans, find themselves squeezed between a strong Byzantium, the Mongols, and the Franks. They have no room for expansion. The Ottoman Empire, which closed the East to Europe for 600 years in our history, was not born. Let's look beyond the horizon, 300, 400 years ahead. The presence of a European kingdom in the East would have made this region a laboratory of ideas, language, and trade, rather than a dead end of conflict. When culture in the Middle Ages does not argue with barriers, it argues with opportunity, and opportunity wins more often. The movement of knowledge would become a normal part of the rear, rather than a rare feat of the front. This would change the calendar of development of the continent, which at that time was not yet called the continent of rationalism, and people would look not at the wall of threat, but at the window of trade, even if it had no glass. The Renaissance could have begun much earlier, perhaps not later than the 13th century, but closer to the end of the 14th century, when the accumulated exchange of Eastern libraries became the daily breath of European science. In real history, the sparks of the Renaissance appeared in Italy thanks to translations from Greek and Arabic, the finances of merchants, and an interest in the heritage of antiquity. But in an alternative model, this heritage would not have been sought in fragments. It would have come quickly and directly in large libraries. Thanks to this, humanism, art, and the exact sciences would have risen more intensely, and the era would have been filled with the meaning of exchanged manuscripts, not just the clang of swords and the sliding of turf from the roof. Greek and Arabic works rarely went directly to the West until the 14th or 15th centuries. More often, knowledge came through translations in Spain or through the Arab East in Latin retellings. But if there had been a frontier kingdom, the libraries of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria would have become a direct bridge of knowledge. This would have created a flow that would have overturned the idea of an intellectual crisis in the Middle Ages, because the crisis arose from isolation, and here there would have been no isolation. In real history, the manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle arrived in Europe much later, via Italy, sometimes as late as the 15th century, when the systematic study of Greek originals began. But in an alternative world, they could have been read in the East earlier and translated more widely. Such a direct connection would have changed the map of the intellectual center. The center of knowledge would have shifted to Bologna, the Sorbonne, and Paris earlier. And new universities would have drawn resources not only from their own lands, but also from the meanings of the East, which did not argue with the calendar of the sea. The University of Acre could have emerged as the first military and commercial center of the orders, later growing into an academic powerhouse. In real history, Acre was the most important base of the Christian orders and the richest port center of the Outremer. The Hospitallers and Templars knew how to manage people, land, and seas, often no worse than the crown. Transferring this experience to the university would mean moving the headquarters of knowledge closer to the water on the map. This university would become a center not only of libraries, but of schools of knowledge. The Levantine lands would stimulate interest in the natural and human sciences. Manuscripts from the East would arrive directly, and it would be easier to transport them than to search for fragments from the 15th century. It would be a new format for the rear of knowledge, where medicine and mathematics do not argue, but are united in logic. And what would have happened to the great geographical discoveries? In real history, the incentive to seek alternative routes arose because land access to goods from the East became expensive and unstable. Byzantium was losing influence. The Ottoman Empire was rising. Ports were competing for influence. Prices were rising and delivery was slowing down. But in a world of stable Levantine alliances, the situation would have been different. The route to India and China would not have seemed impossible, because the impossible does not give rise to a sea of exploration. And here, the sea would have become the path to a normal future. Trade routes in the East did not close immediately, but gradually became expensive and difficult after the Ottomans' victories over the Straits. This meant pressure on the prices of spices, fabrics, and luxury goods in Europe. Why did seafaring become a state mission in Europe? Because they lost the old corridor, and the sea became the new corridor. But if the corridor is not blocked, people rarely invest in the ocean of meaning right away. In an alternate reality, the incentive to find a way around Africa or across the Atlantic would have been weaker. States would not have had to radically rethink their trade routes. Maritime achievements would have remained important, but not explosive, because an explosion dictates a barrier, not the need for dialogue. Tanks, warehouses, caravans, and fleets would provide stability of delivery, reducing the sense of necessity to go to the unknown continent. It would be the wealth of understandable supply instead of the wealth of discovering new land. But even an understandable subject rarely seeks a home across the ocean if there is a home on the shore that works every day. This would create a rhythm where the sea is not only a corridor, but also a frontier of opportunity. There would be many opportunities, but they would be economically known, and therefore the risks would come later. One detail, and the chain of consequences takes on a different logic. In our reality, the Crusades remained a heroic myth and a trauma. The Islamic world consolidated in response to the invasion, becoming more conservative and closed. Europe, cut off from the East, was forced to go out into the ocean, which led to the global domination of the West. In an alternate reality, the world is more balanced and integrated. The border between Christianity and Islam is not an iron curtain. There is a huge gray zone, the Levantine Empire, where cultures mix. Islam, lacking a powerful military triumph over the West, such as the expulsion of the Crusaders or the capture of Constantinople, may be developing along a path of greater fragmentation, but also greater intellectual openness, competing with the West not on the battlefield, but in trade and science. However, this stability comes at a price. Europe, not forced to look for workarounds, could be late to the division of the planet. The technological leap forward, provoked by fierce competition and isolation, might have been less explosive. The world would have been more comfortable, more Mediterranean, but perhaps less dynamic. The story we have painted shows how fragile our present is. The Kingdom of Jerusalem did not perish because it was doomed by historical laws, but because on a specific day, under the scorching sun of Galilee, a handful of people made the wrong decision. The survival of this state would have prevented the emergence of the Ottoman Empire, preserved Byzantium, and created a unique bridge civilization. We would live in a world where East and West are not polar opposites, but neighbors trading in the same market. In this world, there would be no civilizational divide that we still feel today. Subscribe so you don't miss new versions of history